Welcome to this week's introductory lecture. Today we're going to be providing a little context to our reading on N.T. Wright, sometimes called Tom Wright in his more popular writings. He's one of the most renowned New Testament scholars in the world today, writing at both the scholarly and the popular level. He's also served as a clergyman, being for a time the Bishop of Durham, Anglican. His influence is widespread at several levels. Wright has not written a New Testament theology per se, but he has written widely with a discernible biblical theology, and even a New Testament theology, if you will. His New Testament theology's backdrop to his commentaries, both scholarly and in various series. I've highlighted two. He's written a couple of the works in the New Interpreter's Bible on the more academic, scholarly side, as well as his For Everyone series, which he has for most of the books, if not all the books of the New Testament now. It's also the backdrop for some of his varied apologetic works, as well as some more thematic works. And I highlight here, for example, his book Surprised by Hope, which is on eschatology, which draws obviously heavily on New Testament notions of eschatology. And by the way, I liked this book a lot. He was right more than he was wrong, I think, despite his occasional lapses into unwarranted criticism on dispensationalism. But we'll move on from that. But nonetheless, I recommend it as an interesting read. The closest he has to something that would get us toward a New Testament theology would be his Christian Origins series. I think they're all grouped together, considered together now, these 5 volumes. They total about 3,000 pages or so. I thought of assigning you the whole set for this week, but I decided I would hold back a little bit. There are slightly different foci to the various volumes, so I'm going to just split them into the 2 chunks, the Gospels-oriented, Jesus-oriented ones, and then the Pauline ones. His works on the Gospels primarily are in a 3-volume study that's been around a while, the New Testament, the People of God, and People of God, Jesus, the Resurrection of the Son of God is the last one, the victory, Jesus and the Victory of God. These are all very important works in New Testament literature, but they're not as much theology as kind of a historical reconstruction. So in these, he argues for the historicity of the New Testament narratives, fundamental historicity, for the historicity of the resurrection in particular, and obviously there are theological things that pop up along the way, but it's a little more in the historical analysis than in the theological, and that's partly the nature of the Gospels, right? They're narratives, right? So they're recounting history, so that's going to be the focus of works that study that to a greater extent, at least. When we come to Paul, the last 2 volumes, for a while he was calling this his big book on Paul. It ended up being 2 big books on Paul. We reach the more controversial and challenging part of Wright's work, especially in his advocacy what has come to be known as the New Pauline perspective. He's become a target of a lot of criticisms. We won't be able to sort out all of this week. For some of you, this will be your first exposure. For others, you've had some exposure to it, but I doubt any of you have, read everything that's been written on this topic. So we're going to try at least give you an orientation, a good overview of how Wright works his way through these topics, and then expose you to some of the basic arguments as well as at least some of the understandable or at least relatable criticisms. You can always overdose on Wright at a later date. Let me just say a few things about the New Pauline perspective in general. For those of you who might be unfamiliar, this will just be a brief introduction. We'll start with a man named E.P. Sanders, who argued that in his book Paul and Palestinian Judaism in particular, as well as in other writings, that much of the Christian exegesis of Paul was based on a misunderstanding of Second Temple Judaism. So Judaism during the Second Temple period, New Testament era, it's a kind of more generic way to describe it. Judaism was not, he argues, a religion of works. No one thought of it that way. Israel knew its status as God's people was made possible by God's grace, not works. Instead, Israel demonstrated its status as God's people by works. So they're called by grace, but they live by works. And Sanders coined the phrase to describe this, covenantal nomism. So the law is connected to the covenant, and the covenant is by grace. So there is a works part, but it's not what we sometimes think. And he would criticize Luther in particular for reading Paul through the lens of medieval Catholic theology, for example. And so in medieval Catholic theology, you might get the sense that your works get you grace, but that wasn't what Jews in the Second Temple period taught, according to Sanders. No relation, by the way. James Dunn, Jimmy Dunn, and one of you will be doing, I think, Dunn for presentation, more than likely, advanced this notion a bit further and coined the term new perspective on Paul by arguing that for Paul, the works of the law, as in books in Galatians, he has a commentary on Galatians where he discusses this in full, was not about a general reliance on works for salvation. So this wasn't about working your way through salvation, but it's about specific Jewish practices like circumcision that were badges of identity as God's people. And so in the Old Covenant, we showed we were God's people through circumcision. In the New Covenant, we show it in a different way. So circumcision is set aside because that function, as these badges of covenant identity, are no longer there. Wright has developed his own vision or version of New Pauline perspective that we see on display, at least in one form, in your readings for this week. It's developed in part from his overall studying of the biblical and New Testament narrative. And again, I think I mentioned previously that narrative type theologies, biblical theologies, Wright's is one of those. And that includes for him at least distinctive understandings of exile, Messiah, kingdom, and yes, justification. That's the big one. If you'd like to see some discussion more focused on justification alone, that's one theme. Piper's critique of Wright, The Future of Justification, and Wright's response to Piper's critique, which is his IVP volume on justification, are a good starting place. If you read those two back-to-back, first Piper, then Wright, you'll get a pretty good lay of the land of at least some of the key theological and exegetical debates. I don't expect us to be able to work through all of this in your reading of Wright, but he's making a lot of detailed arguments in these later works, exegetical arguments, theological arguments, historical arguments, and all of that. So it's a very complex web of arguments. It's systematic in that sense, right? So it requires a lot of development to get the full picture. So just hearing one definition or one thin slice of it, even just as discussion of justification without some broader context, I think can be skewed and distorted just a bit. C. Stephen Evans, echoing Hayes a bit, I think, argues that Wright works throughout his discussions. This is particularly true in the Gospels, but it comes to some extent even with Paul, with an implicit, what he calls methodological naturalism. That is, Wright uses history in a particular way, in a way that enables him to engage the secular academy well. So he uses the tools of history. He doesn't assume anything, at least in a strong way, anything supernatural about these texts. He just applies rigorous historical methodology to these texts to sort out what's happening, to discover what's there. So he's studying history. In the Gospels especially, you see this, right? Whereas At times it appears we have to have the history figured out before we can get to a proper understanding of Jesus and Scripture and so on. And so it's about history first, theology second, if you will, if you can think of it that way. Wright seems, I think we could argue, a bit unclear on the authority of theological tradition, which is interesting as an Anglican, which highlights the role of tradition. But even the theological beliefs attested by the New Testament documents seem, at least for the purposes of his project, to be subject to historical validation. Now, maybe Wright says, as a churchman, I don't do that. As an academic, I do that. But again, we're at this point. Where is Scripture properly studied? In the academy or in the church? And Wright's methodology and his target audience sometimes seems a bit more on the academic side for at least these major works, the ones we're talking about, these 5 volumes we were talking about, then on the more popular churchly side. I think his For Everyone series is much more churchly side oriented. So it's not that he doesn't do both, he does, but sometimes you can see why he can be criticized for skewing a bit more towards the history rather than theology, more validating the authenticity and the reliability rather than discerning its message and applying it to current life and practice. Again, he is a churchman. That protects him from being too academic at points. And he is an engaging speaker, and he has that lovely accent that always makes you sound smarter and all of that. So he's got those things going for him as well. But nonetheless, this is where some of the tension or critique of Wright methodologically needs to land before we get to the specifics of his conclusions. Related to this methodological thing is just this whole question of how much do we depend on Second Temple Judaism in order to understand the background beliefs of the New Testament. Certainly they were a background for the original authors, and even to some extent for some of the original audience, although less so for maybe, say, the Pauline letters and Gospels directed more towards a general Gentile sort of audience. Given the fact that we can't have a comprehensive or complete knowledge of that period or certain interpretations of what we have. So, we only see parts. We have that's the nature of history, right? We have a limited sample of texts, and we have to interpret those texts. How much we allow our limited sample interpreted by us to shape the way we read the New Testament? Can we justify using that as a near infallible interpretive filter, or is it just one resource? And again, this is the question of backgrounds, right? Do we read the Scripture with no attention to backgrounds, with full attention to backgrounds, with partial attention? How do we balance those things out? That's part of the debate about Wright as well. At the very least, we need to acknowledge a measure of humility in how we deal with Second Temple Judaism and its material. I'm not always sure Wright does that. I think sometimes he leans a bit heavily on this, and that may occasionally lead him somewhat astray. I'm not as strident a critic as some would be for Wright, but I do think there are areas where he could use some nuance, maybe areas where even you can see in his discussion over the last decade or so, he's pulled back or clarified things in ways that are a little less objectionable. Now, again, some of that may just be a function of what happens when you write about an idea. You throw bombs because you want people to really listen to you, because if you just want to tweak something a little bit, people kind of ignore you or nod and say, sure, that's a great point, and are unaffected. So maybe this is kind of just the nature of saying, listen, you need to really think about this differently. Let me just make this really strong. And then when you critique me, in our dialogue, we'll get to a more happy middle place. Maybe that's it. And maybe that's not it. I don't know. But nonetheless, just be aware that there's this stuff going on with his methodology, and especially his reliance on Second Temple Judaism, that are really significant components of how he reads the New Testament, particularly Pauline theology, differently than particularly traditional Reformed theology does. So for those of you on the more Reformed side, just be aware of that. We'll have opportunities to discuss that later. All right, that's all I'm going to do to introduce Wright. Again, there's a lot more, and I'll give you, maybe if I have time, I'll give you some links and some other material. If not, you can find tons of material on Wright. You can go to town on him, but that's not your main focus. I just want you to have a basic orientation so you can understand what's going on when people interact with Wright along the way. Have a great week. We will be in touch soon. Bye-bye.